We're back. It's only been months
Months.
since our
Yeah.
last since our last conversation. Um, for those of you who remember, Aubrey and I are taking the time to go through different major transits that are happening this year, and next year, or I guess basically in the next couple of years, that will impact both the collective and the personal astrologically. For the purposes of this conversation, we are talking about Jupiter in Cancer. Oh, there's so many things to love about Jupiter in Cancer. I think, Aubrey, I want to start by asking you about, because you are Jupiter in Cancer natally, I would love for you to tell us a little bit about Jupiter transits in general, how often they happen, and then Jupiter in Cancer is considered exalted. So, in your own words, what does it mean for a planet to be exalted?
Okay, so Jupiter will enter Cancer on June 9th. Jupiter stays in a sign for about a year. So I think it takes us all the way to June 20th, if I remember correctly, of 2026. So we're preparing for this kind of like new year-long cycle with Jupiter. And the lovely thing I will say about this is that we're moving from Jupiter in detriment in Gemini, which we've done since the end of May last year, into Jupiter being exalted. So anytime a planet is exalted, it's sort of thought to be on its best behavior.
Mhm.
And the sign that a planet is exalted in occurs because the sort of desires, themes, motivations of that planet shares a lot of the same or very similar desires, themes, motivations of that sign. So it is a place where a planet sort of like feels its best. It feels almost as good as when it is at home. Maybe even as good. I don't know. It depends on your perspective on exaltations. But Jupiter in general, as the planet of abundance, expansion, opportunity, growth, justice, travel, spirituality, all of the things, will feel very, very good for the next year. Of course, there are some caveats here, which I'm sure we will dive into. But yeah. So Jupiter takes 12 years to move through the entire zodiac. So, as Anthony said, this is my natal Jupiter placement. So, I will be going through my Jupiter return for the next year, as will anybody that has a natal Jupiter in their chart. And again, that's a once every 12-year transit that you go through. Um, Generally speaking, Jupiter returns are thought to be good years
Mhm.
because, again, the planet of abundance and expansion and opportunity is back home in your chart, doing good things for you. And we generally like to think that Jupiter gives us a reward or some kind of a gift when we go through our Jupiter return.
Yes, yes, we love a Jupiter return. And for those of you who have Jupiter in Capricorn, this is your Jupiter opposition. I often view this as maybe stretching yourself a little bit and seeing how far you can go, or maybe the limits of your container. I like that you talked a little bit about how the qualities of the planet and qualities of the sign align in some way. And Jupiter rejoices in the sign of Cancer, I think, because of the nourishment and fertility it receives from Cancer, right?
Mm-hmm.
I also think, too, because Cancer is ruled by the moon, there's a lot of changeability, there's a lot of flexibility, and there's a lot of fluidity. And with Jupiter being so expansive, I think it really understands those lunar attributes that Cancer can provide. Not to mention that Cancer is also cardinal.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that Jupiter receives direction well from Cancer because there's a softness in its direction, right? There's an
Mm-hmm.
ebb and flow, there's a trial and error, and it's not so like harsh or super direct. And I think the responsiveness of that feels right. Not to mention that Cancer feels like an ocean, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
vast and bountiful, and it feels like it goes on forever in depth, not just in how far and wide, but literally how deep it can go. And I think Jupiter, knowing that it can exist without limits in that ocean, feels
Love
like a really, yeah, it feels like a great representation as to why there's an exaltation in its connection to
that.
Cancer.
Yeah, I love that. I think also we can't ignore this sort of spiritual aspect, right? Jupiter pointing to like what is the truth with the capital T, right? And always asking us to have faith in
Mhm.
something or to take a leap of faith, right? And asking us what we believe in. And because Cancer is ruled by the moon, which is also a very like spiritual, Cancer
Mhm.
is very intuitive, right? So I think those parts of like Jupiter and Cancer blend really well also.
Yeah, I love that. It made me think a little bit about like how, in terms of spirituality, Cancer feels like it might be able to nurture something new too, right?
Mhm.
And in order to have faith, we have to have compassion or grace too within ourselves. And I think Cancer is a really great representation of that also.
I agree with that. I love that. Yeah. So also, if you happen to have your Jupiter in one of the other cardinal signs, if it's in Aries or Libra, this is your Jupiter square. Anthony is a natal Jupiter in Libra. So Jupiter squares for me are always really interesting. Normally, when we're thinking about squares, we think of that kind of like tension, right, between the two signs, where it's like, well, they show up very differently, operate very differently, and all that they kind of have in common in this case would be the cardinal modality, right? But because it's Jupiter and Jupiter that are squaring one another, I think what comes up a lot for people going through their Jupiter squares is that idea of like limitation that we can also see in the opposition, right? I think we get a little overzealous sometimes when we go through our Jupiter squares. We're like, yeah, I got time and energy and space for that. Totally. And then when it comes time to like actually do the thing that you committed to, there can be that moment of like, oops. Like
Mhm.
I don't actually have like the time and space and energy for that. So while I think there's plenty of opportunities that Jupiter will bring for anybody that has their Jupiter in a cardinal sign, unless it is your Jupiter return, I do think there's that question around like what is realistic
Mm.
around like your resources and capabilities and time and all of that.
Yeah, I agree with that. I also think, it's good to remember that oppositions are the nature of Saturn and squares are the
Mhm.
nature of Mars.
Yeah.
So, in a Jupiter opposition, there may be like you may have a tendency to make yourself smaller than you need to, right?
Mhm.
So there's like a restraint. And then like in a Jupiter square, you talked about being overzealous. I think it's because that Martian energy makes us feel like we need to be more dynamic, more action oriented, more impulsive. So I think just having awareness around that as you go through those
Mhm.
transits, I think you'll be fine. Otherwise, Jupiter usually brings something good regardless of the type
Agreed.
of aspect that it applies to your chart. So,
I definitely agree with that. Yeah. And actually, on that note, one of the most important things happening at the very beginning of the Jupiter in Cancer transit is that we are going to have squares with Saturn and Neptune in Aries. And that
mhm.
happens pretty much immediately upon Jupiter's ingress into Cancer because Saturn and Neptune are in those very, very early degrees of Aries.
Right. And if you're curious about those in particular, Aubrey and I spent some time talking about particularly Neptune and Aries in a previous video, so you can understand a little bit more of what that looks like from a historical context. But for the
Mhm.
purposes of this, we're going to focus primarily on the square that it's going to make, obviously, to Jupiter. So the square to Saturn, the Jupiter Saturn square is June 15th, and then the Jupiter Neptune square is June 18th. What you and I kind of talked about today earlier when I was on my walk was, you know, Jupiter and Saturn have already squared twice, right, in 2024. The difference between this upcoming one on June 15th and the ones that we experienced last year is that last year they were in mutable signs, right? So they were in Pisces and Gemini, maybe really pushing us to question how flexible we can be in certain situations, how malleable we can be. Maybe also dealing with those disappointments, as you and I have talked about. Saturn and Pisces felt like bringing up a lot of disappointments, and then of course Jupiter and Gemini was sort of how do we move through that. To me now, as we deal with this final square, it's Cancer and Aries. So now we're in cardinal signs. It's a complete sign shift, which feels like a break from the ways that we dealt with it last year, but also new opportunities, right? there's sort
Definitely.
of this push and pull between now and later, right? I think Cancer is very intentional, right? And how it moves forward. It's the crab, it goes side to side, it doesn't charge ahead. Whereas Aries pays no mind, right?
Mm,
It just blazes forward. And so I think the tension there is going to come from impulsive action that maybe isn't always thinking ahead or having foresight into long-term results or how those actions have consequences.
I completely agree with that.
You and I talked a little bit about like water usage being one of those things. You
Hmm.
know, there's a lot of exploration around AI right now. And we can't ignore the environmental impacts that AI has, right? In particular, it uses a lot of water, right? A lot of liquid resources, literally. And it feels like Jupiter in Cancer, maybe on the negative side, could be the expanse of the usage of water, right? Or the
Hmm.
need
Hmm.
for water to generate something. And Aries, Saturn in Aries feels like a very now
Yeah.
thing that we're only focusing on how this is going to serve us now, not later. So, and of course, Saturn wants us to have long term, right, thought processes, and Aries just isn't into that. And then if you throw Neptune into this, Aries in temperament is hot and arid, right? And Neptune dealing with water. There could be some areas that experience drought as a result of the expansive AI.
Hmm. I completely agree with that. And also like Jupiter being that like excess, right? And the excess use of water, which AI absolutely that is a thing. And we're already starting to see that kind of conversation and pushback from people around like people are just using AI sort of like willy-nilly and not really acknowledging or seeming to care about the amount of water that is required to make AI work, I guess.
Mhm.
And like there's all these statistics that have started to come out about how much water is used just doing one simple AI prompt question search, whatever it is. And we're also starting to see, articles in the news emerging around um, the effects that it's having on the local environment or like cities where these plants are for processing like all of the water and AI and blah blah blah. So yeah,
Mhm.
I love that. I think that's exactly what we will see
Yeah.
in a really big way.
Yeah, I think that, a lot of it could even deal with our power grids, right? Our structures, Saturn, and how that's being impacted as well. It also makes me think a little bit about, if we think about Cancer in this connection to the home, let's expand out the idea of what home is, and it can be country, right?
Mhm.
And then Jupiter having a relationship to law and order, or I guess Saturn really more order, Jupiter law. And then Aries is the impulse around those things. Maybe some of the things we might see is certain laws getting passed hastily that then end up getting revisions. A good example, actually, of this is recently I read there was a recent bill that was passed, and there was in that bill, I don't remember if it was passed, but it was presented, I should say. And in that bill, there was sort of like this 10-year period of not limiting how much AI can be used. And, this was in the US, so in our country, a lot of conservatives were trying to back that bill, but then realizing in retrospect that AI clause was in there, and they're like, oh, well, I don't agree with that. But the problem was that they weren't reading, right? So they were being very Saturn and Aries. They were being very impulsive around trying to push certain agendas or legislation without actually taking that big picture view that Jupiter and Cancer is asking for us to have, is to have a bigger perspective. So it feels like that there's going to be some renegotiations around some of the things that are trying to get passed,
Mhm.
that are for the benefit of the land or the country, um, but probably aren't actually.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I love that. I think that's a great insight.
Which I think this is a great segue then to talk a little bit about Jupiter and Cancer in general, and maybe its relationship to home, but maybe again on that grander scale, its relationship to how countries embody nationalism, right?
Mhm.
So Aubrey and I did a little research. We noted that the US has a Jupiter in Cancer. So this would
Yep.
be the US's Jupiter return. And we looked back at history when Jupiter was in Cancer in previous time periods. Um, and in some cases, there definitely were rises of nationalism within the US and in other countries as well. I'm going to use the US because we're here.
Mhm.
And it feels also just very present and prevalent.
Definitely.
So this is a darker side, I would say, of Jupiter in Cancer. And I want to be clear that Jupiter in Cancer overall is going to be a very good transit. But I think it's important to speak on some of the shadow aspects of a transit so that way we can be aware and maybe pivot the energy into a different place, right? So, um, 2002 was a year that Jupiter was in Cancer. And I think it's really important to recognize that this is coming off of the heels of um, 9/11. Yeah, exactly. And one of the things that we saw incorrectly happen in this country was an anti-Muslim sentiment and the rise of nationalism and protecting America. And, like we all have to come together. In some ways, yes, we came together, right? Very Jupiter and Cancer. We all kind of embraced each other. But then we also began to exclude certain people from that togetherness and that creating scapegoats where there shouldn't have been, right? Sometimes with Jupiter, there is an escapism that
Mhm.
happens with that energy, but it's in Cancer, it's for the greater good of serving the country. Clearly, that's wrong, right? And so, looking at 2002 in particular, there was a lot of nationalism and a lot of like very Americana, a lot of kind of not including certain people based on their belief systems, very Jupiter.
Mhm.
So that way we can maintain this larger scope of belief systems. I don't know. Do you want to talk on that a little bit? 2002
No, I
timeframe?
think Yeah, I think that's a great example. I think we also saw a lot of the tightening of national security, right? And our borders and things like that, which cancer is all about security, right? So I think, that is another kind of like consequence, I'll say, right, of coming off the heels of 9/11 and then going into that Jupiter and Cancer transit. And unfortunately, it also makes me think about what we're kind of dealing with right now in the country around deportations and immigration. And we're seeing like the shutting down of student visas, right, and things like that. And so that's another way in which we are on the wrong side of history right now, and seeing those kind of like similar themes emerging, and to think that that will continue to play out for the rest of 2025, certainly while Jupiter is in Cancer, like, yeah, and our president loves to tout those things as, again, being like America, America. Like his whole platform is about like putting Americans first and making the country good and entering into this golden age. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And like obviously, neither Anthony nor I agree with those things. But I would expect that same kind of jargon, okay, slogans to keep coming and maybe even get louder in some ways during Jupiter in Cancer. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and I think just outside of the scope of the US, that idea around like nationalism, country, borders, etc., is going to continue to play out as well. We noted that the euro came into existence also during 2002, right, with Jupiter and Cancer, and that being an expansion, okay, Jupiter, right, around borders, right? There was very much like a dissolving of borders that happened for everybody on the European bloc that is an EU member. And a unification, right, kind of around the European identity, and what does that mean? And so again, kind of expanding that idea of like country, right?
Hmm.
So it will be interesting to see, I guess, like how that kind of continues to play out or starts to play out over the coming year. We also noted something about Russia, Ukraine, and Crimea.
Yeah, that was during a Jupiter in Cancer transit, and also Jupiter in Cancer saw the reunification of Germany, right?
Oh, yeah,
And
right. Yeah,
and
in
like yeah,
1989.
because yeah, 1980, like late 1989 throughout the 1990s, mostly or 1990, excuse me, the year 1990. So there was a lot. I think what's really important to understand about the concept of country under Jupiter in Cancer is that it can be expansive, like we mentioned with the euro expanding. It can also, though, and of course, like breaking down in terms of expanding. So in this case, breaking down the Soviet Union in order to then give life back to the countries that were once under this union, right? Which can feel expansive, but then also disenfranchising.
Yeah.
And then uh, immigration, I really liked that you brought that up because I feel like if we think about Jupiter and Cancer at its core, right? It's pro-immigration
Hmm.
because it's about being able to expand beyond the home to find somewhere else to be, right? To understand that we are global citizens, we are world citizens. That maybe the thing that we should care for the most is the earth and not
Yeah.
necessarily the borders that exist that
Hmm.
define where we are geographically on that earth.
Hmm.
And I think, as we move through Jupiter and Cancer, my hope would then be that our recent sentiments around immigration will change, or that there will be some sort of justice or fighting back on.
Hmm.
I think a positive view, maybe in terms of, I'm going to say nationalism loosely, during a Jupiter in Cancer transit, Nelson Mandela was released from prison, right? In South Africa. And we understand then that he later became president. And, that was such a wonderful thing, not just for that country, but for the world, right?
Hmm.
And the reason why I bring that up under the guise of nationalism is that we can see how that is restoring justice within a nation, right? It's not necessarily about being, all about making such and such great again, but actually taking the time, effort, and putting in the energy to bring right greatness to a place that you call home. I think in the US, we could see more mass outbreaks of protests. And my hope would be that power then goes back to the citizens, right? The thing about and the reason why I say this is because the moon in astrology is related to the populace, it's the people. Okay. And of course, moon has a relationship to Cancer, Jupiter being in Cancer. So we are able to expand the populace, expand the people, right? And rally us together to move in a better direction.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, my hope around that, and we're thinking about like restorative justice here
Mhm.
in the US, I would love to see whether it will be or not. I would love to see that maybe being like a large dissolving of ice,
Mhm.
and to bring people who have been, all of the people who are being held in the prison in El Salvador, right, and have been wrongfully deported, detained, whatever, to have them returned back to the United States.
Back to their homes where they belong, right?
Yeah.
Jupiter and Cancer. And, maybe it's not, maybe, we may not see ice dissolve, but what we might see is people fighting back more,
And
right?
we are seeing that. No, we're totally
Yes.
seeing that. And I think that's just going to continue to ramp up. Even this morning, when I was on Threads, like the first thing that popped up on my feed was a video of people in their neighborhood banding together and
San
pushing
Diego.
ice out of their neighborhood. Yes. And it's
Yes,
like,
I saw that
yeah.
too.
So I think that we will see more things like that. And it also, to be honest, it makes me wonder if the Jupiter in Cancer transit is going to be the like power back to the people that so many people think Pluto and Aquarius is going to be.
But, maybe it's the micro in the macro, right?
Totally.
So, like, maybe Jupiter in Cancer is the micro version of that. Like, you and I have talked about, when we were on the phone this morning. For those of you who don't know, by the way, Aubrey and I talk on the phone like every
Very
other
much.
day, I feel like.
Yeah.
Yeah. When we were talking about Jupiter and Cancer in general, you know, if we think about the idea of country or commitment to the people, community is the
Mhm.
thing that really matters. Jupiter in Cancer has the opportunity to expand community care, right? So, your neighbors fighting back for against ICE to keep, people home, that's a form of community care, right?
Absolutely.
And this is how Jupiter and Cancer can feel positive and powerful. Feeding the unhoused or feeding your neighbors or giving resources to those close to you, starting a community garden. These are very Jupiter in Cancer sort of activities where we are nourishing multiple people through simple domestic acts,
Yes.
right?
And yeah, and you and I kind of touched on like maybe we do see almost like a resurgence around those kind of like domestic skill sets, right?
Hmm.
And like seeing that perhaps, yeah, I love the idea of a community garden and feeding multiple people. Cancer literally ruling over like food and nourishment and all of that. And we had talked about also maybe seeing some things around like farming and agriculture coming
Hmm.
forward, which we can circle back to. But the other thing that we talked about was like repair, like repairing things instead of throwing them out and buying something new. Like, oh, you have a hole in your bag, maybe you learn how to sew and repair that hole instead of like throwing the whole thing out and doing the like hyper consumerism thing.
You just made me think about a couple things when you said that, and I don't know why I didn't think about this morning. Maybe the matcha woke me up. I don't know. So Jupiter in Cancer feels like the great mending,
Yes.
right? Like weaving and sewing those threads and like mending and repairing, literally, but even like figuratively, where we feel torn, right? Because if
Mm,
if the core of that is about compassion and nourishment and nurturing, then we are able to nourish each other through empathy, right? We are able to mend our wounds through care. Then the other thing that I kind of thought of, and we can touch on this when we talk more about like culture and style. Yes, I love this idea of home economics kind of coming back up into resurgence,
home
right?
ec. Totally, totally.
Yes, yes. I hope schools bring it back.
Yeah,
Um,
me too.
but like thrifting, we talk about hyperconsumerism. I wonder if a really great way to work with Jupiter in Cancer, because I often attribute from a style perspective, Cancer going to the nostalgic, so going back in time and reclaiming styles from the past and bringing them forward. So literally that can look like thrifting, clothing swaps. These are also community care, by the way, right? This is earth care by doing this. It's about being able to literally reduce, reuse, recycle. Yes, to repairing things, but also maybe um, like refacing something, right? You have a
Yeah.
couch or a chair, right? Reupholster it kind
Yes.
of vibe. It was interesting too, because we also talked about how Jupiter and Cancer could be tradwife, right?
Mm.
Because, Cancer can play either side of being conservative or progressive, right? It just depends on the lens in which it's being approached. So maybe a shadow side of this with Jupiter and Cancer could be the continued rise of the tradwife. We like the stipend for having children feels
Yeah.
very Jupiter and Cancer to me.
Okay. I was going to bring that up, so I'm glad that you said
Yes.
that.
Well, because it feels like the returning to the traditional values and traditional family. But on the flip side, we can also reclaim some of these practices in a way that actually brings like more nurturing to community, right? So it could be thinking about with Jupiter in Cancer, expanding the circle that you have that can help you raise your children, right?
Right.
Maybe
Village.
expanding yes, the village, expanding your idea of family, right?
Mhm.
Maybe it's about the expansiveness of family values. It's worth noting that in a Jupiter in Cancer cycle, that the World Health Organization took homosexuality off of the illness list. During a Jupiter in Cancer transit, there was a strike down of the Defense of Marriage Act, which paved the way to the legalization of gay marriage. So those are expanding family values, right?
Yes, 100%.
But in a greater way, in a way that actually is towards progress, not conservatism.
Hmm. I love, oh, by the way, just talking about that, that Jupiter's entering Cancer during Pride. So we love to see it. Okay, we love to see it. But yeah, no, I think those are excellent points at both on both sides, and I think we will see both sides honestly because Trump and JD Vance are like more babies in America, right? And like trying to like push the fact that we need to have bigger families, which is very Cancer, okay? Having a big family, Jupiter and Cancer, excuse me. But then the flip side to that is like all of the abortion stuff, right? That's been like outlawed again, and seeing this rise in like sepsis in pregnant women and all these women that are dying from pregnancy or dying because they can't receive like an emergency abortion to save their own life, right? So again, we see that kind of push and pull, right, between that kind of like conservative weirdness and also wanting like progression in some way. So yeah, I think that makes perfect sense to me. It really does. And the trad wife thing, that's kind of got like two sides to the coin as well, right? Because it is totally rooted in like Christian fundamentalism,
Mhm.
and which I have said we will see a rise of, and I think we absolutely will. But then I think there's also the people that like find an appeal in that lifestyle more from the kind of like home ec,
Mhm.
homesteading situation.
Well, I think it's the difference in your value systems,
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
Because, and I think that's the thing, right? Like Jupiter in Cancer is going to show us maybe where we are more similar than we are separate, right? Where maybe Jupiter in Gemini showed us the duality and like the extremes of something. We're going to see how we're more connected. And maybe we're going to see how certain things are going to be used in terms of manipulation against us and how other things are going to be used in support. So, what I mean by that is let's take a look at Make America Healthy Again,
Yeah.
right? And that, that could feel Jupiter in Cancer, but maybe more in the manipulative sense of saying things like, hey, we're going to remove these things that are actually beneficial and helpful
Hmm.
for the health and long term benefits of humanity. This is also maybe a Jupiter Saturn square sort of energy, too, right?
Right.
That we're dealing with.
And
But then,
Neptune. I think Neptune also because the like illusion and the
mhm,
delusions around like what's actually helpful and healthy. And yes,
especially around modern medicine, because let us not forget that Neptune rules modern medicine and
that
pharmaceuticals,
pharmacy.
right?
Oh my
Yes.
God. You and I are vibing because I was just thinking before you started going into all of this, I was like, oh my gosh, we have to talk about medicine. Because like also for me, Cancer is like the nurse,
I
and
love
like the
this.
like being in like the medical field and offering support and care. That's literally what you're doing, right? Like when you're in the medical field. So yeah, this is perfect.
Well, so it's interesting because then, like, maybe there are certain things that are going to bring more health and wellness, right? Which can feel very Jupiter in Cancer as well. Like, we maybe as a baseline, we all want whole foods, right? We want access to organic, clean, put that in quotes, food, right?
Hmm.
Like I think that that's very clear. But I think the routes in which we go about that or the signaling that we're doing to get there is going to be important, right?
I have a
And go
thought.
ahead.
I'm sorry. Okay, I
No, go
think
ahead.
also this is going to be extra highlighted what you're talking about with the nodes in Pisces and Virgo.
Hmm. Yes, I agree. Right. So it's like the South Node in Virgo is like health, 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 right? And Pisces is like the illusion of that thing. But
Hmm.
then Jupiter's going to come in and say, okay, but like, what's the truth between this? Right?
Yes.
Let's identify the real issue, the core issue, and let's move in that direction. Right?
Hmm.
So this kind of brings us to the agriculture piece where Jupiter in Cancer can really expand agricultural influence, right? And I think it's important for us to understand, though, that there will be that it's going to require some work, of course, right? There might be some legislation that comes up around agriculture. But I think what farmers are going to farm and plant and work on is going to be different. They're going to have to expand what they produce. I think that there's going to be uh, maybe like a unification or a coming together of farmers too. There are some farmers who voted for Trump and then they were like, wait a minute, we didn't vote for this, but you did, right? Like you just didn't know, but you did. And so as people begin to wake up or people begin to realize or have those reality checks, Jupiter square Saturn, then they're going to have to come together and understand that it's through their community that they can push their agendas that they need to support, right? Their work, their life, their home, Cancer. Um, from a positive perspective, I would love to see more like sustainable farming, more regenerative
Mhm.
farming can feel very Jupiter in Cancer.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, it'll be interesting to see what happens to the dairy industry
agreed.
because I often attribute Cancer to like dairy products and milk. And we know that there's like this whole raw milk thing and unpasteurized, which we've also talked about pasteurization in a previous one. I believe it was Neptune and Aries
I
was
believe so, yeah.
where we talked about that. So you can review that there. I'm not going to go into it here, but I think it's going to be interesting to see what happens to agriculture. And I wonder if we're going to come back to focusing on foods that are indigenous to the land. And then that also brings me to, the rights of indigenous people, right? And literally land back movements too,
Mhm.
kind of
Mhm.
coming up through Jupiter and Cancer.
Yeah. No, and it's so funny because I just went to Santa Fe this past weekend. And I recognize that things are not perfect, okay? There's not perfect anywhere. But in Santa Fe, Indigenous culture is so front and center in a way that it's not in like a lot of other places in Denver, for example, right? And the entire time that I was there and like having the experiences I was, interacting with people and eating the food and all of that, I was like, man, like I started thinking about land back in like this really serious way. And I was like, that is actually like so important. And those are
Mhm.
like the original stewards of the land, right? The homeland. And they have all of this like incredible knowledge and like such a skill set, right? Also around nature and the flora and the fauna and our world, right, Mother Earth, and needing to get like be more serious and like have more serious things happen around the land back movement and turning to those people and like learning from them and like because like the native indigenous people like they know what to do to like be sustainable, right? And how to respect the planet. And those are all things as climate change becomes like more and more and more extreme. That's actually the knowledge that is like crucial and that we
Mhm.
need and that we should be like prioritizing. I'll get off
So
my high horse here, but like,
no, no, I totally agree with you. It makes me think of like that Jupiter and Cancer and the Great Mending, right?
yeah,
The Great Restoration, right? The Great Reforestation that can be created. And you're right. Like we need to uplift and kind of uphold Indigenous people so that way they can have access back to their land, right? So in terms of immigration, hey, guess what? We're all immigrants here,
right.
right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So the Indigenous people are the original stewards of this land. And so allowing giving them literally back the land, the ability to be the steward of the land is going to be what's going to create the reversals that we need. Could also be the thing that I'm talking about in the expansion of agriculture, right?
Yeah,
And
I love
shifting the
that.
relationship that we have with agriculture and the abundance of things that can be grown, literally from the land. And this isn't just here, right? This is anywhere that's been colonized. I think it's
Yeah,
also really important to bring that
100%.
kind of attention to.
I agree. And like, we see that like with the French, in a bunch of these places, right, where they're starting to be like, okay, French government, like get out of here. We don't want you anymore. And it will be interesting actually to see, yeah, with like France in particular, how they get pushed
Mhm.
out or in some of those places in like West Africa and Haiti and things like
Mhm.
that. Okay. I love that. I love all of that.
Me too. Me too. I'm like, okay, bye.
Yeah. Okay, so we have, I guess, like a few other things that we had said we wanted to talk about. One of them is absolutely like the style, okay, the influence on pop culture of Jupiter in Cancer, which I'm super interested to hear from you about that because I think like your vision around Cancer and fashion and all of those things is really interesting. And you briefly touched on it, right? Thinking, talking about reclaiming things, mending things, whatever. In my mind, I always think of Cancer as like vintage.
Yeah, absolutely. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's going to be so like the rise of vintage, I think is definitely going to be a big deal. I'm already seeing oddly in like fonts, like literally font that we use in design, vintage is coming back, right? And it has been for a while. Shout out to Paula Abelera. She's the designer I work with on a lot of things. She and I used to create a magazine that Aubrey was also a part of, and we used a very specific font for it. And in this past year, we have seen that font or variations of that font come up, and I think it's going to reach its peak through Jupiter in Cancer. Um, some of the other things that I think are very Jupiter in Cancer, I think distressed denim is
Mm.
Jupiter in Cancer, right? So I think that that's something that we're going to see our favorites, right? Like, what's our favorite thing? And there's going to be like this love of all things favorites and comfortable. I think athleisure will have its moment, but it's going to look different, right? I think it's going to look a little cuter, actually, a little bit looser, a little bit easier. I think the linen girl aesthetic might come forward. I jokingly said to you on the phone that I think it's also going to be the Sicilian girl aesthetic,
Okay, but
right?
explain to people what that
Yes,
means.
I will. I will. I will. It's going to be like long, flowy tunics and like scarves in the hair with the sunglasses and like the hats. And, it's going to feel very like vacay in the Mediterranean.
Mhm.
Um, linen materials, crepey materials, so very similar to like what I'm wearing today, right? The other thing that I also think around Jupiter and Cancer, if you remember, I think Jupiter is tending to define the summer category of the year. Last year was brat girl summer, very Jupiter in Gemini, right? Club girl. Um, Kind of messy and like chaotic and I don't give a shit toward it sort of energy, very brat. And then, like we've had like hot girl summer and we've had like tomato girl summer or
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah.
So, like, I'm noticing this trend around sometimes food actually kind of influencing fashion lately. And one of the things that I've seen a lot of is tinned fish, right? So, we are going to see how that is impacting fashion or the trends that are coming forward. We're going to see sardines on prints. We're going to see tinned fish in different places. That's going to come up a lot in food as well. Charcuterie
Mm.
boards might become like tinned fish boards, right? Um,
I'm kind of obsessed with that actually. I'm like, that sounds really good.
Me too. There's a brand called Fishwife that is like really Fishwife, I believe, and they are making tinned fish very like aesthetic and very beautiful. Well, I'll also say this because I think maybe not so much Sicily could also be like Portugal girl summer, right?
Mm.
Which also feels very like tinned fish and like tinned octopus and like tinned sardines and anchovies. And I think like this is going to be a vibe. I recently walked by an anthropology and I looked at their windows and they had giant embellished sequin tinned fish in the windows. Okay. And like I walked into the store because I was so curious and like
Yeah.
everything was like fish, coastal, Portugal, Sicily, right? And like I had already started feeling this last year and I was like, it's going to
Mhm.
be the peak in like Jupiter and Cancer. And that's where we're headed right now. We're headed to that peak. So maybe also foods that we can play around with outside of tinned fish,
Mhm.
olives. Yeah, like yes, I think like olives can be something. Papayas, right? Melons are a fruit of Cancer.
Oh,
Um,
really?
mhm. There can be like soft cheeses, right? I think this might also be like picnic girl summer.
I was
right?
gonna say, is this just charcuterie like board girl summer? Like, is that what this is? But I love picnic girl. That feels more Cancer.
Yeah, it's totally picnic girl. Because, you and I were like, well, what's the vibe? Like, are we staying at home? Not necessarily. I think we're making adventures close to home, or we're making adventures feel like more comfortable, more beautiful, more exciting, maybe more aesthetic. Who knows? But like picnic by the beach, right? Is that not like Jupiter and Cancer?
Love this. I'm obsessed with this. And actually, I love what you said about like adventures close to home. Like that, okay, I know we talked about like traveling for family, which we'll touch on in a minute, but I think especially with like all the weird aviation and travel things and stuff that are like happening here in the States, maybe the vibe really is more like local travel. Like,
Yeah.
I think about like everybody loves to travel internationally and they like love to go far and wide, which like, of course, okay. But like, how often do you explore like your own state? Like, I think
Hmm.
about this all the time living in Colorado. Like, there's a million beautiful places in Colorado that I could like go explore and that I honestly do not spend enough time doing. Like, I could go to the mountains way more often. I could go down into the southwest corner of the state. Like, there's so much like variety and diversity that happens just in like our local city,
Yeah.
region, whatever. Like, I love that. I'm obsessed with that, actually. I'm
Yes.
excited about that. That feels
Me
exciting
too.
to me.
Me too. And I really love the idea of like taking things with you there, right? Like the picnic, right? Like the music, curating the vibe to the local adventure. That also made me start to think about like, okay, in fashion, we might see more like gingham, right? Which is like kind of picnicky in some ways. We might see certain like mixed multi stripes. We're going to see like the flowy easy like
Yeah.
throw on drawstring pant. We're going to see the handmade items made with
Mm,
care, right?
love
We're going
it.
to see like the rise of the farmers market type of thing. It's going to be
Totally
farmers
get
market
that.
girl summer.
Oh my God, I completely agree with that. 100%. I was just thinking like the vibe is to like go to the farmer's market, get whatever ingredients for your picnic, the local honey, like whatever. I 100% see that.
Yes, it's like she's in her overalls. You know what I mean? And she's wearing her handmade sandals and she has her cute little tote bag with her carrots sticking out and she's buying soap. You know what I mean? Like, this is the vibe for Jupiter in Cancer. I also think embroidered hats, like
Yeah.
baseball caps, that's totally going to be a thing. I've recently just bought a few myself because I also think, what's interesting about the cap is that there's like a protection, which can feel very
Mhm,
Cancerian in some way,
mhm,
but then the
mhm,
embroidery makes it sort of fun and whimsical, which I think can also be very Jupiter in some
mhm,
ways.
mhm, mhm.
And like kind of going back to like the craftiness, I think that there can be an expanse of like craft. If we think back to like 2013, 2014, like I just think Etsy. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
I feel like everyone was on Pinterest, everyone was on Etsy, everyone wanted to craft everything, right? I would be really curious to see also if Jupiter and Cancer brings back physical photos. You know what I
Mm.
mean? Like
Mm.
I just rediscovered my Polaroid camera that I used to use a
Yeah,
lot.
just the other day. Yeah.
Yes. And so I'm like, oh my gosh, wouldn't that be like, I know Instax is a thing now. Like it would be
Hmm.
amazing to see people really reconnect with tangible photographs, right? I jokingly posted something today, I think, where I was like, Mercury and Cancer is girl moss, not girl boss, right? Like we're kind of going off, we're getting off the internet and out into the world. That also feels very Jupiter and Cancer to me.
Yes, I agree. Like we're mushroom foraging and
Yes.
like,
Mushroom
yeah.
Girl.
Yeah, and like, but anything that also feels like super nostalgic, right?
Mhm.
Like when we're talking about like, yes, Cancer can be the parent, but it's also the child, right? So maybe
Yes.
we see that kind of like returning to whatever feels nostalgic, right? From like your youth. Which I think actually will maybe see a continuation of that with Jupiter and Leo, but that's
Yeah,
a
it'll
different.
feel different then. You know what I
Yeah, it
mean?
will feel really different then. But yeah, everything that feels like comforting and like cutesy and yeah.
But you know what this made me think of too?
What?
Recession pop. Because who's more nostalgic? And I'm a millennial, right? Who's more nostalgic? More nostalgic than a millennial, right?
Right.
Especially around like their cultural things.
Yeah.
And like, what's more comforting than fucking recession pop, right?
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
already happening. And so
yeah.
I feel like our comfort music is going to come up. I'm seeing a lot of like Gen Z being like, oh my gosh, how did, like recession pop is so great. And I'm like, yeah, that's how we made it through life, basically, when the world was burning. Which I also think Jupiter in Cancer is going to allow us to find things that make us feel safe,
Mm-hmm.
as there's a lot of change going on outside of us, or outside of our control or in the collective. Jupiter in Cancer is going to say, well, what can we enjoy? How do we find pleasure in the moment or in the things that are kind of within our sphere of influence or within our control? So that way we're not feeling so out of control. I think sometimes with Jupiter and Gemini, we can't block things out. But with
Yeah.
Jupiter and Cancer, we can create the safety net. We can have the shell too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That just sort of made me think of that. But I love this idea of like moving to comfort for Jupiter and Cancer and doing things that we love or that we enjoy, like the recession pop, or the foods that we love, or the clothing that, nostalgia kind of coming forward in a
Mm-hmm.
lot of ways. I think one of the things that I thought of was like, I'm cringe, but I'm free.
Yeah.
And that feels kind of Jupiter and Cancer, right?
Yeah. To me, that feels like the bridge between like Gemini and Cancer is like, yeah, I'm cringe, but I'm free.
Yes, absolutely. But maybe even like nostalgic things. Remember, like knitting was a big thing. Everyone knitted for a while, like appliques, embroideries. Like it goes back to the crafting thing, but I think that there's something there that we're gonna really pull in
Mhm.
um, through Jupiter and Cancer.
Also, one thing I think that we'll see in like the style with Jupiter in Cancer is wearing like heirlooms and like inherited pieces in some
Big
way.
yes.
Like
Also
inherited
costume
jewelry.
jewelry.
Yeah, okay. We both
Because
are like jewelry.
yeah, but I also think like costume jewelry, right? Because that also feels very vintage and nostalgic. And, Jupiter's big and Cancer is like, I kind of want to be adorned. It makes me feel safe, right? I
Yeah.
think like statement pieces are maybe more Jupiter and Leo, but, we
Mm-hmm.
can't discount maybe some of like the aquatic influences of like coral becoming really big. Um, or maybe
Pearls.
like, yeah, pearl being a big deal. Yes,
Which is
yes to
very like
pearl.
vintage feel also with the pearls. Yeah.
Yes. Which can also go back to like, can Pearl feel coastal and easy and like flowy? Yes. Can it also feel traditional? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Can it
Mm-hmm.
also feel
Totally.
conservative? Yes.
Yes.
So this is that duality again that we're going to see show up. It's like the trad girl aesthetic, right? She can feel really traditional, or
Mm-hmm.
it can be like, the girls in her mudding boots and her sundress, picking carrots from her garden, right? That's a whole nother vibe where it, maybe more hippie. We also talked a little bit about the Americana
Yeah.
vibe coming, like Lana Del Rey, but
Yeah.
it's
Lana
like,
Del
so there's two sides to that. There's like the Americana in like nationalism, right?
Rey.
But then there's the counter sort of response to that of like reclaiming Americana in a way that feels in resistance or in
Mm-hmm.
protest to, which can feel like maybe, I think a good example of this, and I don't know if Jupiter was in Cancer during this time, would be like the hippie protests,
Yeah.
right? Or like, Vietnam War protests, or
Mm-hmm.
like the hippie movement, kind of that idealized folk Americana sort of vibe, but it was in resistance to the American government.
That's so funny because the Vietnam protest is immediately where my mind went as well. I just watched this whole docu-series about it that was super interesting. And one of the things that they talked about was that the sort of like American way, if you will, was the citizens that were protesting the war and that were like, we don't want this, and like they
Hmm.
even a bunch of veterans who fought over in Vietnam joining those resistance movements and showing up at protests and saying like this is wrong, right?
Yeah.
And like we the people of the United States do not want this. And so I mean obviously we already see like big growing movements with that same sentiment, right? That's like we the American people don't stand for this. We the American people don't want this. So yeah, I agree. I completely agree with
So Vietnam protests started to, they started in 1966 and they peaked like 1968,
that.
1969. In 1966, guess what sign Jupiter was in?
Cancer.
Hmm.
Okay. So we're gonna see it. It's gonna happen. I love
Hmm. Like it, and it's gonna be in, well, I guess technically they began in 65, maybe, but still 66 was sort of like in that period, and Jupiter in Cancer was there. And so I think, and I love that you brought up like veterans, right? People who served and protected the country, very Cancer, right?
Mhm.
But how they're expanding their viewpoints and ideologies around what that looks like, and actually how serving and protecting isn't about going to war,
Right.
right? Or being at war with our own citizens,
Yeah.
right? It's about creating inclusion, right?
Mhm.
That's the real expansive influence that Jupiter and Cancer can bring. It's like we're all family here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even through our ups and downs and our differences, right? We are all together. We talked about, as a segue, or maybe like kind of a 180, travel themes for Jupiter in Cancer. So one of the things I mentioned to you is traveling for heritage, for culture, for your roots, for your ancestry, but also traveling for family reasons
Mhm.
happening
Mhm.
a lot. Do you want to speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, so I'm about to go to Ohio, which is where my dad is from. It's where that entire side of my family is from, is in northwestern Ohio. And my dad just passed, and so I will be traveling out there and will actually be in Ohio the day that Jupiter enters Cancer, and I will be on our family farm, which has been in our family for like 100 years. Planning, tending to all of these things for his funeral. And I will be staying with my family on the family farm, like literally traveling like for something around my family, right?
Hmm.
And to like that, I mean, that is basically like the place of my ancestors on my dad's side of the family. So yeah, and then you will also be traveling during that time as well.
I will be. So my husband and I are going to Nashville to have a celebration of life for his grandparents who passed away last year. I think, no, yeah, in 2024. They passed away in 2024. Um, and we are going to bury their ashes on their family plot in their family farm, all farm, plot, land, Cancer, family.
Right,
Um,
right.
but also, my mom, who lives like 4 or 5 hours away from where we're going to be, is going to come and visit me. Mom, very Cancer, also. Um, so she's going to come visit while I'm there. So that'll be a really interesting sort of experience, like where I'm also traveling for family reasons and then also reconnecting or having like a reunion with family too. You
Okay, but
know,
that's so funny. Wait, I'm so sorry. I don't mean to interrupt you.
no, it's
But
okay.
like literally, once I get back from Ohio, several days later, I'm going to Wichita to go see my mom. Okay. And then she is going to come to my dad's funeral. And even though they have been divorced for 25 years, like she will be there, and like it obviously will be like this huge family gathering and like a reunion when we do my dad's service.
Mhm.
So yeah, that's funny when you brought up your mom. I was like, wait, I'm gonna go see my mom too.
So yeah, like, it's I think we're going to see a lot of people travel for family or a reconnection. And keep in mind, family isn't blood. It can be your
Right.
chosen family. It's your kin. So whoever you
Yeah,
consider to be your kin, that's who you might travel to see or spend time with, people that really nourish you or that you feel supported by.
absolutely.
Um, I think one of the last things I want to touch on through this, because I think we've gotten through most of the stuff that we want to talk about. Is that true? Yes. Okay, good. I think one of the last things I want to touch on around this is we started this talk with the Jupiter square Saturn. So, one of the hardest aspects. I want to talk about one of some of the best aspects coming up this year. So, three that come to mind immediately, and you're welcome to add in if there's any others. Oh, and I also have one other thing I want to touch on, but it will kind of flow into this. Is the Jupiter Cazimi is June 24th. The Cancer new moon is June 25th, conjunct Jupiter. And the Venus Jupiter conjunction in the sign of Cancer is August 11th. Those are three of the luckiest, most
Mhm.
auspicious, most expansive days of 2025.
Yeah,
Okay.
definitely.
I don't care what you want to do, what you want to start, what you want to put out into the world, but like gold star those 3 days and make them anything you want them to be, because they are going to feel just undeniably held and supported through its unfolding.
Hmm.
If you have
Hmm.
like meetings or offers, or you need to do a pitch, or you have to give a talk, or you're whatever it is, if you're traveling, if you're going to go spend time with family, just know that those are going to be really, really fruitful moments. And the reason why it's also important to understand the fruitfulness specifically around that new moon, right? Is that, as I mentioned, Jupiter is taking its cue from the moon. So lunar transits this year are going to have a major impact on how we move through feeling the Jupiter energy for the rest of the year. And also, it's important to note that the nodes, right,
Hmm.
are in Pisces and Virgo. Pisces is ruled by Jupiter. So that means that the eclipses, September, are going to have, and Jupiter in Cancer and the eclipses are going to have a major impact on each other during the month of September. So I feel like that's worth mentioning as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. We had also discussed on the phone that anytime the transiting moon is in Pisces or Sagittarius, there's mutual reception between the moon and Jupiter, which will also be very nice. And for me, I have sort of just intuitively felt that once Jupiter is in Cancer, the seat of its exaltation, and not in detriment in Gemini, that that's also going to be this kind of big turning point around the nodal journey that we're all going through, both on like an individual level and collectively. Because
Mhm.
Jupiter is ruling that north node, for the whole year and a half that it's there in Pisces. And thus far, it has been ruled by Jupiter in exile, basically, right? And then Jupiter will sort of come into its seat of power, if you will, in a way. And I think that that will have a significant impact on how the nodes kind of like show up in our life, what they're asking of us, what they're doing, etc. Um, so how just how that's going to manifest, right? Like, stay tuned. But I think that's something we can't ignore because essentially what's going to happen is as soon as Jupiter enters Cancer, because it's there for a whole year, right? And we will have just a hair over a year left of the nodes in Pisces and Virgo. It will essentially carry us the entire rest of the way through that transit, with the
Mhm.
exception of about 2 weeks of Jupiter being in Leo at the end.
Right. And to I think also support this, when Saturn moves back into Pisces in early September, because it's also eclipse season, right?
Yes.
Jupiter is going to be supporting Saturn by that point. It will be late enough in degree that it will be in a trine to Saturn. So we go from feeling a square in the beginning to midway through the transit actually receiving like harmonious aspects from Saturn, and how
Yes.
that also is going to support eclipse season and the nodes in Virgo and Pisces.
100%. And I think that will also make the way that we experience Saturn and Pisces feel a lot different than the way it was for like the entire, 2 years prior to this. So yes, I think that's a good point. I actually hadn't thought about that, but totally. Like that's
Yes.
yeah.
So where 2024 was really hard with Saturn in Pisces because it was receiving a square from Jupiter and Gemini the whole time. Towards the end of this year, when Saturn moves back in, it's there's going to be a lot more ease, kind of
Mhm,
that we'll
mhm,
feel
mhm.
through that transit.
Okay. Loving that for all
Ah,
of us. Thank
me
God.
too. So from a personal perspective, Jupiter in Gemini is going to, excuse me, Jupiter in Cancer is going to feel amazing, right?
Yeah.
I want you all to reflect back on the end of 2013, beginning of 2014, and in 2002, if there was anything really
Mhm,
important going on in your lives during that
mhm,
time. And also in 1990, right? In late 1989, that was another time that Jupiter was in Cancer as well.
mhm.
So, just kind of reflecting on those periods, if there was anything that you felt was incredible, just know that you can capture those themes and bring it forward. Personally, I made major life changes in the beginning part of 2014 that led to one of the greatest periods of my life. And so I'm very excited to see how I can recapture that in this upcoming Jupiter in Cancer transit.
Yeah.
So,
Same on all fronts. So, yeah. All right, my friends. Thanks for listening to us.
yes, of course.
We
Thank
love you
you.
all.
Yes, we love you. And I'm going to put the ways in which you can connect with us below.
Mhm.
Aubrey, you can find her on all forms of social media, specifically Threads is her best. She has a great little Substack where she details a lot of astrological information. You can do the same for me. You can find me on Instagram, Threads, Pinterest, all that jazz. Obviously, here on YouTube. I'm going to be that person you can like and subscribe so you can see more of our videos. And I also have a Substack called Musings in Transit, where I bridge astrology with more like everyday things like fashion, food, music, etc. So, alrighty, our friends, have a wonderful day. Happy Jupiter in Cancer.